Good evening, and I believe we are now live. Congratulations. Hey, we made it. We made it. And welcome to Assassinating Thomson. My name is Bruce Horak, and tonight, this afternoon, depending on when you're watching, I'm going to attempt to paint a portrait in the next 55 minutes. Now, to begin, I have some special thanks to make. Big special thanks to the National Arts Centre of Canada, Facebook, Slate Music, the RBC Foundation, and Sirius XM for their support in presenting this series of hashtag canadaperforms. Now, as I said, my name is Bruce Horak, and this is Assassinating Thomson. And in 55 minutes, and the entirety of the show, I'm going to attempt to create a portrait. Now, usually when I do this show, when I attempt to do this feat, I'm performing for an audience of people, and I paint the entire audience. But of course, things being what they are, everything's gone totally COVID. You're on your side of the screen, and I'm here looking at this screen, which I guess just kind of has me, which seems appropriate. But I thought, I'm going to change things up a little bit, as this is these are strange times, and I wanted to try something different tonight. I want to challenge myself, so I'm going to create the portrait on this iPad here. It's going to be a digital portrait tonight. And following the show, you can actually get a copy of the portrait that I create and a time-lapse video of the portrait as it is created. So you can click the link below after the show, and that's how you can get the portrait afterwards. I've gathered together a few old friends here in the room with me. I've got my childhood stuffies gathered around the room. This is the owl that I had as an infant. In the back there is Chewbacca, and there's an ugly doll back there, and I think we've got a one-eyed sock monkey looking in. And I did want to introduce you to this little fella here. This is Truffles the Bear. Now, Truffles is a one-eyed stuffed teddy bear that has been my friend for 44 years. My father brought this bear to me when I was an infant, when I was a baby, in the hospital in Toronto. And I had just been through the surgery that would leave me legally blind. It's true, I'm legally blind, although I believe the politically correct term is vision impaired, and I had to be politically correct because I don't want to offend myself. But I like the term legally blind because it kind of trips off the tongue, and it is what it says on my driver's license. Now, since 2011, I have painted close to 600 portraits in an attempt to capture the way that I see. And in those series of portraits, the sitting usually takes about an hour or so, and we have a conversation. We, have a dialogue. But since Truffles and Chewbacca aren't saying much these days, I thought I would help to pass the time this evening by telling the story. Sunday, July 8th, 1917. Drizzly day at the tiny cottage community of Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park, Ontario. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 39-year-old Tom Thomson, landscape painter with remarkable promise, packs up his dove-gray canoe with camping and art supplies, paddles off across Canoe Lake, and disappeared. 8. Thomson's bloated corpse surfaced in the lake. There was a gash on the left side of his head, blood in his ear, air in his lungs, and around his left ankle there was fishing wire wrapped meticulously 17 times. They buried the body quickly at the tiny cemetery up by the big birch tree. The coroner pronounced it accidental drowning. Well, the prevailing theory was that Thomson had stood up in his canoe, had lost his balance, fell, hit his head, and drowned. But if it was drowning, then why was there air in the lungs? And if it was an accident, then why the fishing wire? So what if it wasn't an accident at all? What if it was murder? Dun, dun, dun. Now, not long after this, Lawrence Stewart Harris, Thomson's friend and patron and fellow painter, he arrived at Canoe Lake and wanted to see the spot that had inspired so many of Thomson's paintings. One night, Lauren Harris is sitting at a campfire near one of Tom's favorite spots to camp, and he hears a rustling in the woods. He turns to see a shadowy figure emerge from the woods wearing khaki pants and a plaid shirt. The mist shifts, and the figure is gone. The next day, Harris is out paddling in his canoe, and he sees in the distance a dove-gray canoe with a shadowy figure coming toward him. The mist shifts, and the figure is gone. To this very day, it is said the ghost of Tom Thomson haunts Canoe Lake. Dun, dun, dun. Now, many people ask me what the most difficult thing to paint is. Is it the hands? Is it the feet, the face, the crushing reality of one's own mortality? For me, the most difficult thing to paint actually is the very first brush stroke. I want this to be really good and everything's going to follow that first brush stroke. So I tend to put it off for as long as possible. Something I've been actively demonstrating for those of you paying attention. I've often wondered why, if procrastination is so bad, why does it begin with a pro? Yeah. Oh dear. It's like the program is frozen on me. Oh dear. Well, let's just start it again, shall we? Oh my, there we go. Clink. And this again. Here we are. It can be very difficult to talk and paint at the same time. You're using two conflicting parts of your brain at the same time. It can lead a person to repeat themselves or get lost or repeat themselves. So what I've done in order to help me follow along in the story, if I ever do get lost, is I've created what I call a trigger map here on the ground. It's little bits and pieces of the story. And, if I do get lost, wow, what is happening here? Whoa. If I do get lost, I can just look down at my trigger map and hopefully be able to find my part of the story. Technology is not working. It's not our friend today. So instead, what I'm going to do is something else. Hold on. See, this, my friends, is the live experience as it happens. We've also got a sketchbook, and we can do it in the analog way. How about that? We'll just do it analog. Right. So where was I? Yes. Well, I should probably mention that as a person with very limited eyesight like myself, I've got about 9% vision. I tend to walk into things rather abruptly, quite often, usually head first. It's resulted in a number of concussions over my life, and it's led to some memory issues. So, if I do get lost, I've just got this lovely trigger map here to help me along, and that's very useful. So what was I saying? Right. The tricks, right. I have a few tricks to help me get out of the verbal mode and into the visual mode. And the first trick that I like to use is the observation of edges. So I'll demonstrate. If you have a look at my hand here. Now, the verbal part of your brain, that very quick analytical part of your brain will immediately leap in and define what it sees. Says, yeah, that's a hand, there's 4 fingers and a thumb. But we need to slow the brain down now and get into that visual mode. So observe the edge, just the edge of my hand. You see, there's no word for that edge. And if I put it up against the other hand, and you were to draw just the edge, the question becomes, are you drawing the left hand, the right hand, both, neither? See, careful observation of edges slows the dominant verbal mode down, the visual picks up, and time evaporates. Edges. Now, I first encountered this Tom Thomson mystery when I was in high school. My high school art teacher had a poster in the art room of one of Thompson's paintings. I think it was probably the Jack Pine, this beautiful tree, water in the background there. And she told us the story as a bit of a ghost story. I was completely hooked at that point. We used to imagine that water there and the tree, this was where Thompson's body would later surface. I discovered also, as I was learning about the Thomson story, that Tom and I actually share a number of edges. To begin with, same birthday. Tom and I were both born on August 5th. I mean, what are the chances, right? Like 1 in 365, right? Yeah, edges. I found a bunch of other things too, other similarities. Most of them were completely banal. But here's something really weird. Apparently, one of the people who was suspected of having killed Tom Thomson was a man named Shannon Fraser. My girlfriend in high school's name was Shannon Fraser. It's true, although I can't really prove it because she won't accept my friend request on Facebook. Yeah. Now, as I said, I found a bunch of other similarities that were completely banal. But Thomson, right? So he bums around in his 20s, was always broke. Yeah, this guy too. Eventually, he moved to Toronto, Ontario, and got himself an apartment near Yonge and Wellesley. And at 34 years of age, Thomson met a man named Lauren Stewart Harris. Now, Lauren Harris was this rich, wealthy socialite. He really wanted to get a movement going in Canadian art. You see, Canada had not had an art movement, an official art movement at that point. And he really wanted to get something going. You see, he believed that a nation will be known for its words, its deeds, and its art. But most importantly, its art. Now, back in 1917, actually 1914, Canada was having this identity crisis. Didn't really know what it meant to be Canadian. We hadn't had a true Canadian art movement. And most of the art that was being done at the time was very pretty, was very pastoral, didn't really reflect Canada. There was this thinking about Canadian art that, it's bad enough to have to live in Canada. Why would you want a painting of it on your wall? Harris and his friends, well, they wanted to get a movement going. And they realized, well, if they're going to get a movement going, they kind of need a figurehead, right? Now, Tom Thomson, he had been working during the summers. He was going out to Algonquin Park. He was a guide. He would be fishing and hiking and showing people around. But in the wintertime, he worked for an advertising agency in Toronto called Grip Limited, where he meets some other artists who would eventually go on to form the Group of Seven. And one day, Thomson shows up at the office. He's got a paddle over one shoulder. He sits down in the middle of the office. He starts showing off his J-stroke. And his brothers and his friends are like, what is this? This guy, he looks fantastic. He looks like a real rugged man of the woods, a real Canadian. He'd be perfect. So Lauren Harris says to him, he says, listen, Tom, I am going to pay your expenses for 1 full year if you devote yourself to landscape painting. Tom Thomson, 34 years of age when he picks up the paintbrush and begins to define himself as a painter. 5 years later, his body surfaces at Canoe Lake. There's a gash on the left side of his head, blood in his ear, air in his lungs, fishing wire wrapped around his ankle 17 times. Canadian art would never be the same. I myself was 34 years of age when I picked up 2 things that would forever define me. One was a paintbrush, and the other was a white cane. Now, I lost 90% of my eyesight to cancer when I was a baby. It's true. So if you'd like a quick demonstration of roughly how I see, if you take your right hand and you cover your right eye, and with your left hand, make a little tube, a little tunnel, and look down through that, like the size of a straw. Now, squint a bit so it gets all refracted, and imagine all sorts of floaty bits and flashing lights. You can go ahead and watch the rest of the show like that, if you like. I don't recommend driving home like that. Although I assume you're already at home because you're being safe. But this has been my normal. My whole life it's been this way. Never really known any different. Used to have to wear these really heavy bifocal glasses as a kid, It It was super heavy. They used to make my eyes super buggy. My nickname in elementary school was Fish Face because of the way that my eyes would sort of bug out. It was very difficult to pretend to be fully sighted when you're walking around with the Hubble telescope on your face. Now, in the summer between grade 11 and 12, I got myself a very first contact lens, which was great because I got rid of the bifocal glasses and I could pretend to look fully sighted. I spent the whole summer between 11 and 12 working on my fully sighted look. A little something like this. Yeah, with a look like that, I really fit in. I learned to fake it pretty well. And of course, learning to fake it led directly into a career in theater. Eventually, I moved to Toronto, Ontario, got myself an apartment near Yonge and Wellesley. And at 34 years of age, I get a phone call from my agent, calls me up and says, Bruce, listen, there's a movie shooting in Toronto. It's called Blindness. And in it, there's an epidemic, a worldwide epidemic. Everyone goes blind. He says, you'd be perfect for it. So the only problem is you don't really look blind. Could you look more blind? I said, yeah, I can look more blind. No problem. So I found myself down at the Canadian National Institute for the Blind in Toronto. And I asked the fella at the front desk, I said, hey, listen, can I get one of them white canes? And he says, absolutely. Now, wait a minute. You're 34 years of age. You've got 9% eyesight, and you've never had a white cane. Man, you must get hit by a lot of cars. I'm like, yeah. Give me the cane. How much? He says, well, the first one's free, but you have to have mobility training. I'm like, oh, great. 34 years of age, and I'm going to learn to walk again. Awesome. So this woman shows up at my apartment on Yonge Street where I'm living, and she's going to give me my mobility training. Awesome. So I get this white cane, and she says, here's what you do. You unfold it, and you hold it like a golf club, she says, which is a hilarious thing to say to a blind person. Although, personally, I do love the game of golf. It's very zen. Anywhere. Now, I'm holding on to this white cane and thinking to myself, great, this is going to make me into a target. I'd spent my whole time in Toronto. I would move up and down the sidewalks. I got my shoulders up, my head down, kind of dodging around people, basically the living embodiment of Frogger. Holding on to this cane, I'm like, great, this is going to make me into a target. But then the words of Ani DeFranco come to mind. And Ani DeFranco once said that every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. So she says, hold the cane, roll the tip on the ground in front of you like a radar. Keep your head back, head up, shoulders back, and just move up the street. So we go on to Yonge Street. I'm moving up the sidewalk, and the first thing I realize is just how good it feels to stand up straight. And then I notice people leaping out of my way, some of them directly into traffic. I go down onto the platform at Wellesley Station, standing there with my cane. The train pulls up, the doors open. This person grabs my arm and pulls me onto the train. This guy jumps up and he's like, hey, you want my seat? I said, no, it's fine. Thank you. My legs work. I get to the corner of Bay and Bloor. I'm standing there with my cane and just enjoying the beautiful cityscape in front of me. And suddenly there's a hustle and a bustle across the street. And a friend runs over and grabs my arm and she looks at the cane and she says, Bruce, it's Naomi. How are you? Yeah, you see, spent all my life giving zero indication that I'm blind or vision impaired. Spent all that time trying to pretend that I was fully sighted, trying to see the world through two eyes that I don't have. And that white cane says, hey, man, why don't you try looking through one? Now, another fantastic trick to get out of the verbal mode and into that visual mode is the observation of negative space. Here, I'll demonstrate. If you have a look at my left hand again. Now, the verbal mode will pop in and define what it sees. It says, yeah, that's a hand. There's 4 fingers and a thumb. But don't observe the hand itself. Observe instead the space between the thumb and the finger. Just that shape. And the shape between all the fingers and around the hand. At some point, The brain may flip the image so that you're looking at the negative space and not the hand, like when Bugs Bunny runs through a wall and just leaves that outline, negative space. And if you were to draw just the shapes, around the fingers, between the fingers, just those shapes, inadvertently, and most surprisingly, you also draw the hand. See, careful observation of negative space slows the dominant verbal mode down, the visual mode picks up, and time evaporates. Now, I think that the space between the fingers and the shapes around are just as important as the fingers themselves. What you leave behind, and the world without you. The last project that Tom Thomson was working on when he disappeared, he called it an Encyclopedia of Nature. Did 62 landscapes in 62 days. He was chronicling the changes of Canoe Lake and the environment, every day a painting, every single day for 62 days. His chronicle of nature. Now, he wasn't going for a photorealistic representation or anything of the sort. He was going for a feeling of what it was to be in those woods, sharing that environment. It's gorgeous. Now, when I first started painting, April 1st, 2011, I decided that I wanted to do as much of a painting practice as I could get my hands around. So I painted basically a portrait a day for an entire year. 365 portraits in that first year. And I realized creating that work, and by that practice, that all the obstacles that I have as an artist, they're all internal, they're all up here. My external obstacles, food, clothing, shelter, sustenance, these are all the external obstacles. But all of those internal ones, these are the artistic ones. And if I took care of my practice, if I kept creating, if I worked at the practice, inadvertently and most surprisingly, the art took care of me. This is the most unique portrait I think I've ever done. Who knew? Of course, the technology would fail. So much setup. So much setup. A world without us. More color. We must have more color. I just grabbed the first articles that I had, which turns out to be these felt markers. It seems also appropriate, as I'm isolating here without most of my art supplies. But we improvise. Back to the trigger map. Where was I? Oh, yes. The next fantastic trick to get out of the verbal mode is the observation of relationships. So I imagine a frame around the image that I'm going to create, a frame. And within that frame, I cut the image right down the center. And from the center, there are two halves, and I divide those two halves into another half. So there's quarters and then eighths and sixteens. And I imagine a grid over the canvas. And I place that same grid here and begin to block it out into manageable pieces. And how these pieces relate to each other, the observation of those relationships then creates the work. and the world. See, careful observation of relationships slows the dominant verbal mode down, the visual mode picks up, and time does that thing. Relationships. So what were the relationships in the Thomson story? Well, one of the people suspected of having killed Tom Thomson was a man named Martin Blecher Jr. Now, Martin Blecher Jr. was a short, stocky German-American with a bad attitude who apparently hated Tom Thomson. The two of them got into a huge fight. The night before Thomson disappeared, the argument was so heated that eventually the two men had to be pulled apart. The last thing that Martin Blecher Jr. said to Tom Thomson as he stormed off into the woods, he says, "You better stay out of my way if you know what's good for you." The next day, Sunday, July 8th, 1917, Tom Thomson disappeared. So what if Thomson was paddling up Canoe Lake and he passes Martin Blecher Jr.'s place on his way up the lake and he sees Blecher standing on his dock. Blecher calls him over. The two of them get into the argument from the night before. It gets heated again. Martin Blecher Jr. picks up a paddle and hits Thomson on the side of the head, killing him instantly. He takes the body out to the middle of Canoe Lake, dumps it, hoping he never gets found. It's possible. It's possible. Now, every book that I find on Tom Thomson, there's a photograph of a woman. The woman is standing in the woods. She's got on an ankle-length dress. She's holding a fishing rod in one hand and some fish in the other. She's looking right at the camera. And the caption reads, "Tom Thomson's girlfriend, Winnie Trainer." I find another book, same photograph, same woman. And this caption reads, "Tom Thomson's fiance, Winnie Trainer." I find another book, same photograph, same woman, but this caption reads, "This is not Winnie Trainer." So what do we know? Well, we know that Winnie Trainer and her family have a cottage up at Canoe Lake, and it's right beside the cottage of Martin Blecher Jr., the short, stocky, "you stay out of my way" guy. And apparently Martin Blecher Jr. also had a bit of a thing for Winnie Trainer, which gives us a very tidy love triangle, also a very good story. And right next to that cottage then is the Mowat Lodge. Now, the Mowat Lodge was owned by a man named Shannon Fraser. Dun, 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 Shannon Fraser. Now, apparently, Shannon Fraser and Tom, they were good friends. Tom had lent Shannon Fraser some money a few years previous. Now, one day, Shannon Fraser finds a letter in Thomson's room, and the letter is from Winnie Trainer. It says, "Dear Tom, you have to get your money back from Shannon Fraser. You have to buy a new suit. We have got to get married." Now, Shannon Fraser ascertained that Winnie Trainer was pregnant. Not only that, but Tom was planning on abandoning her. You see, he'd been packing up his things and sending them out west, surreptitiously hoping that no one would notice, planning on ditching Winnie Trainer and the unborn child. Shannon Fraser was the last person to see Tom Thomson alive on Sunday, July 8th at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, what if Shannon Fraser confronted Tom about his plans to abandon Winnie Trainer? Right? And they get into an argument. And he's like, "Listen, Tom, you gotta give up these artistic ways. You gotta settle down, do right by Winnie Trainer. You can't abandon her." And the argument gets so heated. He grabs Tom, he shakes him, trying to shake some sense into him. Tom falls, hits his head on a fire grate, puncturing the left side of his head, killing him instantly. Shannon Fraser freaks out. He's like, "What am I gonna do?" So he takes Tom's body out to the middle of Canoe Lake, and he ties it to something heavy like the fire grate, something heavy, and 17 times should do it. He dumps the body in the water, hoping it never gets found. It's possible. It's possible. Not long after the body surfaced and was buried at Canoe Lake, Winnie Trainer and her family packed up and they moved from that area. They went down to the States for about a year. So what if she was pregnant? What if she went down to the States and she had the baby and she gave it up for adoption? You see, the records have been lost, so possible. It's possible. Now, the reason that I have any eyesight at all is because of my father. Now, when I was diagnosed with bilateral retinoblastoma, that's cancer of the eyes, the treatment at the time was to remove the eye completely. See, the fear is that it's going to go up the optic nerve to the brain. And it was so bad in my right eye that they had to remove it. So this eye here, this one's artificial. And as an infant, I used to pull the eyes out of my stuffies just so that they, became part of my tribe. Now, in my left eye, well, there were just these 3 small tumors, and my dad fought to have them save some of the eyesight. So just because there were these 3 little tumors, they packed me up and they flew me to Toronto, and they blasted the left eye with radiation. And the thought was that the eye would be covered with scar tissue, and I might have some perception of light and shadow, and that'd be about it. But by a happy accident, I've got this little window in my retina that's clear. And that is a window through which I see the world. About 9%. Now, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2002. And in the last year of his life, we had some pretty remarkable conversations. And my dad said something to me that I will never forget. He said, perhaps we can get to a point where we no longer grieve what is lost, but we celebrate what remains. Now, he was talking about my brothers and I and my mom and how we would go on without him. But I realized that I had spent my whole life grieving 91% vision that I don't have and hiding the 9% that I do. And I wondered, is there some way that I could celebrate this eyesight? And who better to celebrate it with than my dad? So I decided I was going to paint his portrait. So I spent the year practicing. And eventually I got back to Calgary to be with my dad. And he'd been through his chemotherapy and his radiation. He didn't look like himself anymore. He looked like he'd aged about 20 years. I think of my art as a way to mark time. And that was not a time I particularly wanted to mark. August 5th, my birthday, 2003, my dad passed away. I made my way back to Calgary and joined my 3 older brothers and my mom. And, the 4 of us got together, and I don't know if you've ever seen 4 brothers together, but once one of us starts giggling, it's unstoppable, and oftentimes in inappropriate places, the 4 of us together in church laughing. And, we would be laughing, and you're laughing in a place where you shouldn't be laughing. So it's even funnier. And then the laughter would turn to tears because, well, we were in the midst of our grief, but then the tears would turn to laughter, and it'd be really hard to tell where one ended. I started painting portraits in 2011, and a friend of mine asked me, she said, hey, did you ever do that portrait of your dad? I said, no, I hadn't. So I got a canvas and decided I was going to try to paint a portrait of my dad from memory. Now, it had been a number of years since I'd even looked at a photograph of the man, and I could not remember what he looked like. Another trick to get out of the verbal mode and into the visual is the observation of shadow and light. So, to demonstrate, have a look at your own hand, or even just feel it. You can feel the valleys and the peaks, shadows and the lights. Within each shadow, there are a multitude of tones. Within every highlight, there are a multitude of tones. And as the eye moves from the shadow to the light, as the hand moves from the valley to the peak, it can be very difficult to tell where one ends and one begins. Careful observation of shadow and light slows the verbal mode down, the visual picks up. Time does that thing. So I'm standing in front of this blank canvas, trying to what my father looked like. Nothing was coming. There were memories. His study in the basement. My dad was a teacher. He would come home after school and he would go down into his study and mark his papers. It was often one of our jobs to go down until dinner was ready. What I remember mostly was the smell of that room. He was also a comic collector. And the room was full, floor to ceiling with comic books, and the smell of those musty newspapers, brings me right back there. They say that smell is the closest link to memory. Or pipe smoke and old wood. He had this beautiful old roll top desk. So I'm standing in front of this blank canvas, and I can't remember what the man looked like, but I'm brought back by these feelings, by these emotions connected to color. So I decided to start mixing up some of those colors that are coming to me. Thomson believed, and the whole group of 7, they believed that color and emotion, they were closely linked. And so I start mixing up the emotions and start painting these beautiful colors. And I'm stuck in this pipe smoke, old wood, kind of deep brown hue that I'm just throwing on the canvas, and I go into that for a while. And eventually I take a step back and I see his roll top desk. And there's even parts of it that I'd forgotten were there, the little cubby hole where he would keep his nibs and the recycled paper on the side. So I go further into this and I keep painting, and there's a hunch over the roll top desk. So I start painting the hunch. It's beautiful. I take a step back and I realize, oh yeah, it's 1986 and there's this horrible sweater starting to emerge. And there's the shape of his cheek. So I start painting the shape of his cheek. And the jet black hair graying at the temples. His glasses start to emerge. And I spend what feels like an eternity just painting this picture. And it's like he's in the room with me, Eventually, I show the picture to my mom. I take it upstairs and I show it to her, and she says, yeah, you got him. It was a beautiful haunting. Yeah. Ghosts can be beautiful. They can also be super creepy. Here's a story. 2013, I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia, living in what the Vancouverites charmingly refer to as a garden suite. It's a basement apartment, probably about the size of what you see behind me here. Now, at the front of the apartment, there are 2 sliding glass doors, that beyond which is the sidewalk, and you can hear people moving by with their bottles and cans at all times of the day. So you lock the sliding glass door, and just to ensure that they aren't actually going to open, in the bottom of the glass door, you put a stick. Now, over here against the wall is the IKEA couch, which folds down into the comfortable and charming IKEA bed. Now, late one night, I'm in that liminal state between waking and sleeping, and I've got my back to the apartment and I'm facing the wall and I'm just kind of dozing off, and I hear what I think is the glass door start to open, and I feel a breeze on the back of my neck, and I think, did I forget to close the door? And then the breeze is interrupted as though someone has stepped into the room, and now they're standing against the side of the bed, and I very slowly start to roll over, and I open my one good eye and I see khaki pants and a plaid shirt, and I wake up screaming. The room is empty. There's a presence that still lingers. I spend the rest of the night in this feeling of unease. The next day, I get on the bus to go off to rehearse, and I'm reading in my research about Tom Thomson that the last thing he was seen wearing was khaki pants and a plaid shirt. Later that day, in rehearsal, I open up my email account, and I get an email from Tom Thomson. Now, someone has started an online account as Tom Thomson. They're tweeting every day as Tom Thomson. It's TT last spring on Twitter, and he tweets every day as though it's 1917 and he's Tom Thomson. He says things like, going up to Canoe Lake, gonna hang out with Shannon Fraser, hashtag awesome, that sort of thing. And I get an email from this Tom Thomson, and it's just 3 words. It says, "I'm following you." Yeah. You see, people take this whole Tom Thomson mystery very seriously. Very seriously indeed. You see, the ghost story of Thomson has been around for a long time. Since 1917, as a matter of fact. That the ghost still haunts Canoe Lake. Yeah, it's true. You see, back in 1917, the body surfaced quickly, and they buried it quickly at the cemetery at Canoe Lake. And a few days later, this telegram arrives to Winnie Traynor. It says, "Dear Winnie, could you please make arrangements to have Tom's body exhumed from the cemetery and shipped to the family plot in Leith, Ontario?" So Winnie Traynor makes arrangements with an undertaker by the name of Churchill. Now Churchill, he arrives at 8:00 p.m. By midnight, he's done. In the morning, they ship a sealed metal casket to Leith, Ontario. But here's the thing. The ranger who helped load that metal casket onto the train said, there is absolutely no way that one man could have done what he claims to have done in the time that he'd done it. One guy, Churchill, shows up at 8:00 p.m. with a shovel and a lantern. He goes up to the cemetery. One guy. He digs down 5-6 feet of dirt by himself. He jumps into that 5-6 foot hole by himself. He opens up the wooden box all by himself, moves a gelatinous mass out of a 5-6 foot hole by himself. Then he jumps out of that hole. He puts that gelatinous mass inside a metal casket. He seals it up by himself. Then he fills in the 5-6 foot hole with dirt by himself in 3 hours. The other thing is, when they move the casket onto the train in the morning, the ranger says, no, it's not heavy enough to have a body in it. He goes up to the cemetery to have a look around. He says, there's not enough dirt moved around, maybe enough for a gopher hole. No one in Leith, Ontario opened up that metal casket to see if the body was actually in there. And it remains sealed to this day. So, what if? What if the undertaker knew he had himself a grisly task? So, he shows up at the cemetery, says to everyone, it's all right, guys, I got this. He opens up the metal casket. He fills it with some rocks and some dirt. He seals it up and has himself a 2.5-hour nap. It's possible. It's possible. Which is also why when Winnie Traynor moved back to Canoe Lake, she would go up to the cemetery and she would tidy up the spot and lay some flowers at the spot where Tom actually was. Because she knew that Tom would want to remain there. It was his muse. And that is why the ghost still haunts the lake. It's possible. It's possible. Now, another trick to get out of the old verbal mode and into the visual mode is the observation of Gestalt, or the big picture. So what you do is you take a big old step back from the work. Now, as a person with extreme tunnel vision like myself, and I've had a cataract, and there's all sorts of floaters and flashers. When I take a big step back, this just kind of becomes hot mush. Yeah. I mean, I have to work pretty close up in order to see what I'm doing. And as I said, that's starting to look a little distorted. But new bits and pieces start to come into focus. That's the benefit of this Gestalt thing. The observation of the big picture slows the verbal mode down, the visual picks up, and time does that thing. Gestalt. Now, the ghost story gets told around Canoe Lake. The shadowy figure and the mist shifting when the figure is gone is told over and over again. By 1956, it was a legend at Canoe Lake. And one night in 56, these four guys decide they're going to go up to the Canoe Lake Cemetery, and they're going to figure out once and for all if the body is still buried there. So these four guys, they get some shovels and some lanterns and a bunch of booze, and they start digging around the Canoe Lake Cemetery. And eventually, they find a wooden box. And inside the wooden box, they find a skeleton. And the skull has a hole on the left side of the head. And these four guys are like, this is great. We have found Tom Thomson's body. He's actually here. This is fantastic. They take a bunch of photographs, and the government comes along to examine the remains. And why they don't arrest those four guys, I got no idea. But the government comes back and says, nope, those are not the remains of Tom Thomson. Those are the remains of a 20-year-old First Nations male. But here's the thing. One of the four guys who was there when they exhumed the skeleton, he was a doctor, and he said, those are the remains of a 39-year-old Caucasian male. Tom Thomson was 39 years of age when he disappeared at Canoe Lake. Now, the remains get put back at Canoe Lake Cemetery, which is where they remain to this day, which is why the ghost still haunts the lake. Now, photographs of that skull, they eventually make their way to a forensic specialist who recreates the face that goes along with that skull, and it is unmistakably the face of Tom Thomson. Upon further examination, we realized that the hole in the left side of the skull was not made by a canoe paddle or the side of a canoe or a fire grate, but in fact, that hole is a bullet hole. You see, there's teeth missing in the skull, as though someone shot him. They were standing above and behind him, while perhaps he was in his dove gray canoe. It's possible. It's possible. Back in 2013, as I was working on the script that would eventually become Assassinating Thomson, I made my way to Calgary, Alberta, to the Glenbow Museum. And I asked the woman at the front desk if they had a Tom Thomson painting. I was really hoping that perhaps he'd put a clue to his own murder in one of his own paintings. Yeah, it was a little outside, I suppose. The woman at the front desk said, yeah, we got a Thomson. It's just upstairs on the second floor. And as I was going up the stairs to the second floor, she shouted at me. She said, if you want to know who did it, I'll tell you. It was the girlfriend. I'm like, what? Winnie Trainor? She says, yep. She found out that Tom was planning on abandoning her, and she went blamity blam. That's what I would have done, she says. Great minds think alike, you know. They haven't seen my ex-husband in years. You can't write this stuff. Honestly, that's what she said. Could it have been Winnie Trainor? Yeah, that's possible. Could have been Winnie Trainor. It could have been Hugh Trainor. Winnie Trainor's father could have shot Thomson as well. Or, of course, back in 1917, the woods were full of poachers. Could have been a poacher. Could have been a whole family of poachers out there poaching away. Come on, kids, we're going poaching. Blamity blam. They could have shot Thomson accidentally. Blam, sorry, Mr. Thomson. Or, what if it wasn't Tom Thomson at all? You see, the body had been in the water for over a week, badly decomposed. Could have been anyone, right? Khaki pants and a plaid shirt back in 17, that was practically half of Canada. So what if Tom was actually out in the woods? He'd injured himself, maybe he'd hurt his ankle, and then he hears on the wind, hey, they found Tom Thomson. So Tom thinks to himself, hey, this is the perfect opportunity for me to escape. So he packs up his things and he goes out west. He changes his name. Eventually he gets an email account and he emails me, I'm following you. It's possible. Hey, listen, if we're going to step outside, if we're going to step way outside on this thing, let's go way, way outside, all right? In 1917, Lauren Stewart Harris was in Barrie, Ontario, training Canadian soldiers how to shoot. Lauren Harris was an excellent marksman. Now, I know what you're saying. Barrie, Ontario, Canoe Lake, that's too far for a bullet to travel. But what if? What if Lauren Harris gets on a train with a bullet and he puts that bullet in the head of a landscape painter with remarkable promise? Why? Why, you're wondering, why would Lauren Harris possibly do this? Well, here's the thing. You see, Lauren Harris really wanted to get a movement going in Canadian art. He'd been all over the world. He'd studied every great movement, every movement of history, and he realized if you want to start a movement, you gotta get a martyr. Blammo! Also, Lauren Harris, he really wanted to be the rock star of Canadian art. And there was Tom Thomson, 39 years old. He'd only been painting for 5 years, and already his work was rocking him to stardom. Was Lauren Harris jealous? Blammo, it's possible. Also, Lauren Harris wanted to get a movement going, a political movement. He wanted to put Canada on the international scene for art. Right? He wanted to really get things going. So it had gone from just murder to something political, to an international movement. So it had gone from murder to assassination. Blammo! It's possible. See, after Thomson had disappeared, after his body had surfaced, after they buried him at Canoe Lake, after the ghosts had started haunting the park, Lauren Harris bought a rail car and he invited 6 of his friends to join him out in the woods, and they would paint in the style of Tom Thomson. And if you see Harris's work at the time, it closely resembles the work of Tom Thomson. Now, of course, eventually Harris's style sorts of change, and he stopped signing his work. Now, many say that Lauren Harris stopped signing his work because he wanted the canvas to be valued on the canvas and not on the signature. But others say Harris stopped signing his work because every time he tried, it came out Tom Thomson. It's possible. Not likely, but it's possible. Now, Lauren Harris was born in Brantford, Ontario, which also happens to be where the W. Ross Macdonald School for the Blind is. Now, in 2012, I was invited to Brantford, Ontario to speak at the W. Ross Macdonald School for the Blind as a visually impaired visual artist to talk to those kids. Now, I was a child of the integrated school system, so the thought of a whole school full of blind and deafblind kids kind of freaked me out. I didn't really know what to expect. So I showed up at the school to talk to these kids, and in an effort to be vulnerable, I told some of my stories. I talked about using a white cane, not having a dog, that sort of thing. And on my way out, as I was leaving the school, this young fella came up to me and he said, "You know, I see just like you." He says, "I got about 10% vision. It's really hard because I don't have enough vision to be sighted, but I'm not blind enough to be blind." And I looked at that kid and I said, "You know what? No one sees like you." For my 39th birthday, I took a trip up to Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park. I wanted to see the spot where Tom supposedly had been murdered, where he'd been found. I wanted to see the grave. Was really hoping to see the ghost, maybe get my own perfect theory about who killed Tom Thomson. And we went to the ranger station to ask if they would be able to show us where the grave was. And the ranger said to my buddies and I, they're like, "No, we can't show you where the grave is. It's on private property and you can't go anywhere near it, so don't even try." And while we're in the ranger station looking around, I see there's a bookshelf over in the corner. And on the bookshelf, I see a copy of Northern Light by Roy McGregor, which is a book I had actually just finished reading. And I knew that on the inside cover of that book, there was a hand-drawn map of Canoe Lake, and there's a little X on the map where the grave was. So while my buddies distracted the ranger, I went over to the book, I opened up the cover, I took a photograph of the map, and then I emailed Roy McGregor $10 for copyright infringement. The next day, we're hunting around the woods, we're looking for the grave, we get completely lost. And eventually, we decide to go back to the canoe, and this young fella pops out of the woods. And we say, hey, man, can you tell us where Thomson's grave is? And this kid's like, yeah, no problem. You just go down the path. There's a pile of dirt with a stick in it. That's the trailhead. Just follow the trailhead, and you'll find the graveyard. So we march our way down the path. We find the pile of dirt. There's the stick. And we go up the trail. Top of this hill, there's a big birch tree with a white picket fence around it. Inside the picket fence, there's 2 old graves. Outside the picket fence, just around the corner, there's a white cross in the dirt, unmarked. That's the grave of Tom Thomson. So I have a seat beside the grave, and I'm expecting a flash of insight or some great, epiphany there. Nothing. There's there's a word for our ability to find concrete things in the abstract, for our brain's ability to see these concrete images in something completely abstract. It's pareidolia. It's a word I absolutely love. It refers to seeing images in clouds, like, oh, there's a toaster, or there's my Uncle Neil, or whatever. Pareidolia. I love it. Cloud spinning. Yeah, it's much more romantic, I think, than assassination. So here's a little cloud spinning for you. 1917, Winnie Traynor gets a telegram from Tom Thomson's family asking that she make arrangements to have the body exhumed from the Canoe Lake Cemetery. So she contacts an undertaker by the name of Churchill. They make arrangements to meet at the train station. They walk from the train station together to the cemetery, and on the walk, Winnie Traynor, Tom Thomson's girlfriend or fiancée or mother of his unborn child, she's stricken with grief. You see, Tom is gone, and his story is over. He will fade into history. In a few years, she won't even remember what he looks like. You see, you want to wipe a person from history. It's simple. You just stop telling their story. What makes a good story? Well, mystery. The last project that Tom Thomson was working on when he disappeared, 62 landscapes in 62 days. 20 of those paintings have never been found. So what if they get to the cemetery? Winnie Traynor convinces Churchill to open up that metal casket, to fill it with rocks and dirt, and inside she puts 20 of Tom's paintings. They seal it up. They send it to Leith, Ontario, where it remains to this day and has never been opened. See, now his work is unfinished and the story will go on. And every year there's another theory. There's another book coming out, another idea, another movie, another play about the mystery of Tom Thomson. And it goes on, and there's a million theories, from murder to accident to a big fish to assassination. And it goes on. You see, every story changes by the telling and by the teller. And if you can't remember the story, you make it up. I do. And if your technology crashes, you improvise. You grab a sketchbook and do something else entirely. That is pareidolia. I asked a painter friend of mine, I said, how do you know when a painting is finished? How do you know when a sketching is finished? How do you know when your art is done? And he said, Bruce, see, that's a struggle that every artist has. You know, there's a conversation that happens between the artist and the canvas, paint, and the subject, and the creative source. And if you close your eyes and you still see that painting, you still see that picture, well, then some part of the conversation has been unexpressed, and it's your job to go back in and express it. Get in there and converse with the art. But if you go to bed and you see something else, you see anything at all, then maybe, just maybe, it's finished. Thank you very much. This has been a very unusual performance of Assassinating Thomson. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you spending time with me here today. And I do want to give a huge thank you to the National Arts Center, to the RBC Foundation, to Facebook, to Slate Music, to Sirius XM, and to all of you for joining me here today. I'm going to show you this work. And if you're interested in getting a copy of this, I'm going to take a photo of it. I'll take a high-res photo of it, and you can get a copy of that. If you click the link below the picture here, it'll send you to my Patreon page, and you can sign up. All of the proceeds for the next month are going to go, I'm going to donate those to canadahelps.org, which is supporting our frontline workers in the fight against the coronavirus. And if you don't want to sign up for one of the tiers, you can just make a donation and those will all go. And for that, I will be sending you, I was hoping to make a digital time lapse of this, but unfortunately my tech crashed. So there you go, we improvised. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you again. I'm going to hold this up to the screen and you're going to see my sketch of what I was looking at here today. Thank you all so much for joining me. And this is what I saw, the way I see it. Thank you for joining me. And be safe, everyone. Take care.